Today with you, I'm going to define what remote viewing is, show you some examples of what that means, go into two types of training methods that we used to train the remote viewers, and then we're going to wind up with practicing ourselves, because I'm going to walk kind of slowly through this and give you a chance to practice on some targets yourself, and then have some time for questions. Now, fortunately, I'm the last speaker this evening, so there's no such thing as going over in my case. This definition is said to be the coined definition, coined by Stanford Research Institute. Ingo Swann, the famous remote viewer, says that he kind of brought this to SRI, and they kind of adopted it as a definition. So what this means is that people seem to be able to perceive things that are outside the realms of their five physical senses. For example, if I was to ask you, where is John Schmutz right now, and I'm not going to tell you any more information than that, then you would have to kind of say, in your mind you dance around a little bit, I'll bet he's going to dinner, it's dinner time. No, I wonder where he is, and that's not remote viewing. Making guesses and analyzing where he might be is not remote viewing. Remote viewing seems to be the ability of some people to develop a knowingness, some sort of ball of knowingness. Sometimes it's visual information, sometimes it's sensory information, sometimes it is just a ball of information that says, listen, I know that's where he is. Well, how do you know? I just know that's where he is. The type of information, though, that this remote viewing person, a person with this human ability, tells you might not always match what you would get if you hired a private detective and say, well, go tell me where John Schmutz is right now. And you might say, oh, well, he's at the corner of 5th and Main in a restaurant having a hamburger. That isn't the kind and style of information that a remote viewer would provide you. He might say, well, I hear a lot of noise and I smell food and I think he's sitting down, so there'd be kind of this sketchy, broad-based information without any specific kind of deliberates to it. Now, how do you discover, how do you find out whether someone can do this? And more importantly, in the job that I was given in the military, rather than testing for the efficacy of remote viewing or the Soviet experiments, I suggested to the intelligence command in the Army that we develop a cadre of people already with security clearances, military and civilian personnel, and look then at that concept of, here I am, 1977, and the Army says, okay, we see this as a security threat, let's put together a team of people, train them, and we'll use those people targeted against our own systems, the Abrams tank, the B-1 bomber, our own development of weapon systems in the Army, and see then, by comparison, if the enemy is looking at those targets, this is the kind of information they would get, because our own team of remote viewers looks at these targets and here's what they find out. So it's a way to assess your vulnerability to this kind of a security threat. But you have to be able to train people to do this. So we went out and interviewed 109 different people, had 6 different traits that we looked for, personality type traits that we looked for, and then we set forth, by contracting with Stanford Research Institute, some tasks to train, in one sense, but in the other sense it was also kind of a screening kind of a thing. Imagine yourself coaching a Little League game and you get all the 9-year-olds to come to learn to play baseball, and what you're going to do is you're going to try with everyone, put everyone up to bat, see which one can hit the best. Put everyone on first base, see how they do at first base, and you kind of pick your team out of the high performers in that kind of a situation. So that's what we did with the people that we picked from the Army, these intelligence officers and civilians. We sent them out to SRI and said, run them through a few trials of remote viewing as you know it, and let us know who does really well. Now, the kind of training or testing that they did was very simple. Think for a minute that you want to train or test somebody, some kid in the Little League, to see how well of a batter he's going to be. Well, you give him a bat, and you put him on the plate, and then you get a pitcher, and you pitch him a few balls. And, the kid swings, and he hits, And so you say, okay, this guy's going to be a good hitter. So let's parallel that. How do you do that in remote viewing? Well, you take a person and you put them in an isolated room with an interviewer or a monitor, and you introduce them to a third party. And you say, you know, here's Mr. Schmutz, or in this case it happened to be Dr. Putoff up at Stanford Labs, and said, here's Dr. Putoff. Do you remember meeting him? Yes, okay. Now, while we're in this room, Dr. Putoff is going to go downstairs and pick an envelope out of the drawer, and in the envelope it's going to tell him to go someplace. And so the guy might say, well, gee, I think he's near a big giant building. Well, what's the shape of the building? Well, it looks like this. What else do you know about that? And he said, well, I hear the sound of running water. Okay, and so they come out with descriptions like that, and then you take the person out to that location wherever Dr. Putoff was later, after he's done all his drawings, and compare the accuracy of what he did. Well, you seem to have got the big building, but we don't see any water here. So what you're doing, let's jump back to the Little League now, what you're doing with that guy is, okay, you hit the ball really good, James, but if you'll turn your feet in a little bit more and bend your knees, now choke up on the bat, okay, give it a move on to different targeting techniques. Now they don't follow in their mind or report in their mind where Dr. Putoff has gone. You give them a picture in a sealed envelope and say, describe the location in the envelope. They say, okay, it seems a little different, I could do that. Or you give them a geographic coordinate somewhere on the planet, and they say, describe the area defined by 37 degrees north, 15 degrees west. And they seem to be able to do that as well, because they've built up this confidence that seems to be able to answer that task. When they step up to bat and you pitch it to them, they seem to be able to swing really well, because they've been practicing, they've got some confidence. The following examples are brought to you by Joe McMoneagle. Joe McMoneagle is one of the people that I recruited for the program and trained in remote viewing. He has volunteered these examples here. When you do remote viewing, after you're through with the remote viewing, usually you do some sketching and some drawing. Here's what the results of his remote viewing of the location in the sealed envelope was all about. And we see here, you know, some sort of a structure that has lots of grids in it. He says everything's metal, used to raise and lower objects. He definitely says it's not for rockets. You know, we might think, well, first of all, maybe it's a rocket or a gantry kind of thing. Notice the kinds of things that the remote viewer picks up. The point of these examples is to show you that the remote viewer picks up some of the things and some of the essences. He's not going to tell you everything about it, but he's going to be able to tell you some things about it. And sometimes he'll tell you something misleading because it will remind him of something, and that'll get kind of mixed up in his head as to what it really is. So in this case, this is what the object really was here. It's kind of a drilling platform out in the open. So let's look back at kinds of things. He had several elements, some trailers, some sort of high object. He actually says maybe a drilling platform, something tall and narrow, that kind of thing. Jump back in your minds now to 1977, when I was a young intelligence officer, and imagine I thought of this as being a military threat. If the enemy was able to do this, even that good, it presented some sort of a military threat. So that's how I got involved in this. Now the next example comes also from a sealed envelope. Now just to remind you, you sit in a room, an isolated room with an interviewer, or sometimes they call it the monitor, and then a remote viewer. Joe McMoneagle kind of liked to lay down and kind of get into a meditative state as he started his remote viewing, and then he'd go on and talk about the target, and then afterwards you'd interview him. Well, you remember when you said this, and you remember when you said that, and ask him to draw pictures after he verbalized everything. He drew this as a result of focusing on this picture in a sealed envelope. Again, let's put this in kind of a real-world scenario. If I said, well, we know that the drug shipment is coming in on such and such a situation, and we know the courier is going to meet, and they're going to meet at this particular location. So let's say, make up a name. His name is Jose Ramirez. And you say, we have a picture of Jose Ramirez from his drug arrests in the past, and we know he's going to do the pickup this time. So we put that in a sealed envelope, and we say, describe the location of this individual at 10 o'clock in the morning, but we don't know where it is. So we asked a remote viewer to tell us where that might be, and this is the information that he comes back with. You know, where's the crime going to take place? Can you tell from looking at this where it might be, where that might take place? Okay, the greenhouse in Golden Gate Park is a very interesting concept. There's some of those elements there. What if I told you the city also happened to be Seattle, Washington? Would that help? Okay, we always think of the needle, but this doesn't have, you know, tall and high and touristy, and it doesn't have some of the characteristic things. You know, if you were a police officer in Seattle and somebody gave you this drawing, could you figure out what they were talking about? What's that? King Dome Stadium, okay. What criterion does it meet? You're looking at the shape, but he says it's a glass dome, greenhouse, very wet, humid, confined, heavy, huge and overbearing. It confines plants or bird-like creatures. There's a place in Seattle that looks like this. I'm presenting this because it's an excellent example of remote viewing, but was it something valuable, something worthwhile? Did it have practical application to it, even though it's an excellent remote viewing? Now, what are the bird-like creatures? They're the fish swimming around in the water, out there, Has this been a kind of a good example for you? Even though we have an excellent remote viewing, okay. And what's important here is Joe is sticking to the rules of remote viewing. We don't want him to start guessing where this is. You don't want to say, yeah, but where is he? I know, but where is he anyways? You don't want to drive the remote viewer into that kind of analysis, because then he starts guessing. He says, well, I don't know, maybe it's the Space Needle. Yeah, that's a good idea. And he starts modifying his drawing and making it look more and more like the Space Needle. So the rules of going through the process of remote viewing have to do with not trying to make the statement or analyze where it is, just present your description. Okay, so here we are with a couple of examples of this kind of by the process of remote viewing, and you know that the initial training or orientation had to do with this local targeting, where Dr. Putoff would go out and you had to find Dr. Putoff or whoever it might be. Well, there came a time after a year or so that our remote viewers were getting pretty good, and they could respond to different kinds of targeting, and we began to use them with military-type targets, Army weapon systems, so forth and so on, and collect technical data. And it came time to say, well, how good could this get? What could we do to improve the performance of the remote viewers over this initial kind of thing, which was just kind of mimicking the stuff that was done at SRI? One of the things you might do with your Little League player then is you would start pitching him fastballs and start pitching him curveballs and start pitching him a slider to see how well he held up during that kind of a situation. So we gave them different kinds of targets, different challenges to remote view to see how good they could do. And out of that developed different skills and talents. Out of that developed people who did better at looking at nuclear targets, people who did better at looking at things that had to do with directions. Look north, look south, describe what's under you. People who did better working with people, kind of a remote telepathy kind of a thing beyond remote viewing. So by challenging the skills, we were able to improve, just like pitching them a fastball, pitching them a curveball, so forth and so on. But we wondered whether or not there weren't techniques or refinements to the process of, well, just tell me where you think this is, that could be used with these people. These two things that we're going to talk about, first I'm going to talk about extended remote viewing, next coordinate remote viewing, have two entirely different philosophies behind them. But these were the things that we in the Army Intelligence Corps, when we started to train people in advanced kinds of training beyond this initial introduction, decided that we wanted to allow people to perhaps move in a direction which improved their performance. And you might think about that again in terms of teaching someone to play piano. Some people do really well at reading music, others like the chord system, others play by ear. And you don't demand that they go do the other one if they're doing really well in this one. If your mission is to create a musician in the end, you adapt to and provide them with that which nourishes the talent that they have. Now, this concept of extended remote viewing comes out of the general idea and concept that the remote viewing signal, the psychic knowledge that you obtain when you're doing remote viewing, is very quiet and low and kind of hard to detect. It doesn't compete well with everyday activities and cooking dinner and going to the store and driving, that it doesn't get into the threshold of consciousness because it's just too low. It's kind of in the background. So maybe if we can quiet the body down, quiet our mental thinking processes down, that the kind of ratio would change in what we become aware of and alert to. So this idea of extended remote viewing then was the idea of training people to get into kind of a quiet or meditative sort of a state and then respond to questions about the target, then respond to where is Dr. Putoff or what's in the sealed envelope, what's at these geographic coordinates. So it was a matter of teaching people how to do that. We called it extended remote viewing because it took longer to do than the other kind of remote viewing, as well as they seem to get deeper into, get more direct contact with the target. But this is only one school of thought. It starts out by having the viewer focus on a particular state of consciousness, describing what they perceive, and then after they're through describing, they kind of get up and you say, remember when you were talking about the so-and-so? Can you draw me a picture of that? Draw me a picture of that big building you talked about. And then you can kind of ask questions about that and see the pictures like we were seeing a minute ago in the examples. Analytical techniques. How do you look at the remote viewing information that comes to you? Now, we're looking at this in terms of determining its value. Is it of some practical use? We're not looking at it in terms of a scientific analysis as to whether it's true or it's not true or it's valid or it's invalid. We're looking at this, is there some practical information? We're accepting a fait accompli that the remote viewing process works, and we're concerned about whether or not it's going to be a threat to the security of the United States. And so we're looking at the value of the information. And so what we do is to look at the data itself and compare it, compare the drawings with what we might have. Maybe we have some overhead satellite imagery and say, well, he seemed to be on target. He seemed to be describing the right area. We review his descriptive elements and say, well, he talks about trucks and he talks about people in uniform. Yes, that's correct. We're not talking about an aircraft carrier. We're talking about a motor pool place where there's tanks and jeeps and stuff. So, yes, that's correct. And then we do a linguistic examination of his ongoing verbiage as he talked about this site. And we look for these very interesting characteristics. The use of past tense verbs, the use of conditional kinds of analytical phrases, comparisons, metaphors, and similes, and how much present tense active voice is there. Now let's have an example of that. If I was, supposedly I was the remote viewer in this, and I'm trying to describe some place, and the monitor asks me, well, tell me about this place. And I say, well, you know, it was, past tense, it was just like a comparator, what I remember as my elementary school. Okay, that's breaking all the rules of what we would say that statement probably doesn't have a lot of validity in it. Past tense, comparative, and conditional. So it probably, this place probably isn't anything like a school. We can't jump to a conclusion that this is an elementary school. It might be a red brick building. So what you're looking for then in an ideal description here is present tense active voice. You're looking for him to say, I'm standing outside of a large building that extends to the left and the right, and its color is red. Present tense, active voice, straight descriptions, no comparisons, no metaphors, no similes. That kind of information breaks out as being much, much more accurate than past tense debriefing. So there's an analytical kind of a way to look at the information. The semantics of the words that we use kind of limit our perceptions. In extended remote viewing, the rules say that it's okay to use I'm over it, I'm above it, I'm next to it, go around to the left side, go underneath. In a minute, when we fast forward and we talk about coordinate remote viewing, you can't do that. It's not in the rules. Because in that technique, in the mental world, there are no prepositions or action verbs. So this kind of concerning yourself about words only applies to the school of thought or philosophy surrounding this meditative type thing. And we would allow the remote viewer to orient his descriptions in that way. Prompting or cueing. Remember we talked before in the initial kinds of training where Dr. Putoff would go out and then you had to describe where Dr. Putoff was? Well, there are other kinds of things. We found that we could use random numbers instead of coordinates because what was necessary was some sort of resonance between the target. So what we would do is we took a picture in a sealed envelope and then we would hit the random number generator and come up with 1357246. And forevermore, that envelope was 1357246. And so then all you had to do is say to the remote viewer, 1357246. And that was enough to get them to describe what was in the envelope because there was some sort of a resonance there between the two. You could use a picture, show someone a picture. We found that it was a lot easier to put the picture in a sealed envelope. You might use just a descriptive phrase. There were some people that didn't want to know anything and you just said the word target. In feedback, in a learning situation, you want to provide somebody with some sort of a feedback so they can compare in their own mind, they can learn, just like, you know, learning to play baseball. Obviously, when you hit the ball, you get some feedback, and your coach says, yeah, that's really good, do it again, swing harder, and finally you get a home run, and you get everybody cheering for you. That's feedback and learning about what was the right thing to do, keeping your eye on the ball, keeping your knees bent, your shoulders back, so forth and so on. Well, you provide feedback to the person learning the situation in the same way. You're enhancing a human behavior. Now, when you get into the military operations kind or some sort of practical applications kind, you can't always provide feedback. I mean, you're asking the guy what's in the sealed building, and it's not like you have a picture of it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be asking him. So what you can't always give perfect feedback about everything that's going on. Try a remote viewing in this thing called extended remote viewing. So everybody, you know, has to get into an instant meditative state and focus on these coordinates. This example has been used at other lectures, so if you know the answer, you can't cheat. You can't play the game, you know. Don't try to come up with the name of where this is. Just think about very rough kinds of descriptions. Even, you know, one word or something like that. Okay, anybody want to share just a couple of impressions? Uh-huh. Okay. Tell me the raw elements that make you say bridge.
Water.
All right.
Water.
Okay. Okay. I have to be careful now that as you're talking to me that you don't make up descriptions that match what you previously said. There is a bridge right nearby this, so by challenging you in front of all these people, I'm just saying don't make up a bunch of things that sound like a bridge. Just tell me the raw elements of. I mean, you go in your mind, go stand on the bridge and then look back at the target because I know there's a bridge nearby. Anybody else want to volunteer something? Uh-huh. Okay. Concrete, wet concrete. Uh-huh.
I got candy for some heat over time. Then I got a gold color. And then I got a roadway. And it smelled hot. But there was a damp to the house.
Okay, there's several people that think dampness or humidity or heat or water is nearby. I liked what you were doing with your hands. As we see when we get into coordinate remote viewing, there's the concept that this works through the autonomic nervous system, and so you might find yourself, well, you know, golly, I can't tell you what it is. You know, all the time you're drawing with your hands, kind of a thing. Any other volunteers? Uh-huh. Okay. Okay, what is the common element of bridges then? Something that spans something or goes from one point to another, you know. That's why sometimes you look at the raw data. I remember Joe McMonagle one time in a remote viewing out in Stanford Research Institute came right out and said, it's the beach, it's at the beach. And then finally Russell Targ wisely said, well, Joe, what is it that makes you think it's the beach? And he says, well, there's sand here. Joe, are there people in bathing suits? No. Do you hear the sound of the ocean? No. Then really all that's at the target is sand. Yes, that's right. I'm sorry, it's not the beach, it's sand. So we tend to run into our perceptions just really quickly, really fast. Turned out to be a brickyard with a big pile of sand, you know, where you go and mix your cement and stuff. And Joe had come down in all this sand and said, oh, I must be at the beach. No, you're in the pile of sand is what you're at, kind of thing. So we tend to run really fast with some of our concepts. This site was, look at your own remote viewing here, and it's the St. Louis Arch. This is a relatively easy target for people to get. I like to use it because it's a very dominant kind of shape, and it is right next to several bridges that cross over the river, and that has to do with orientation too. You have to think about the remote viewer might be standing with the, not by location standing, but perceptually standing with his back to the target, looking out and saying, oh, I see a big river and bridges across the river. I'll turn around. Oh, man, you should see that thing up there. You know, kind of thing. So it's a matter of understanding. You had a question?
No, but I got the bridge and I got a tower, and now I see there is a tower.
Oh, sure, sure.
But I didn't get the arch.
Well, you were standing in the middle of it looking and everything else. Good, good. That's why I liked your hands going up. I was like, come on, tell me the words. What are the words? I can see the angle in your hands. Uh-huh. It's on a cement platform. And the dampness and the wetness would be appropriate, too. But remember the examples I showed you before about, you know, the derrick and the tower and the aquarium and everything? What we see are elements. I didn't want any of you to come up and say, the great Kreskin says it's the St. Louis Arch. You know, that is not what remote viewing is all about. Okay, the label St. Louis Arch is this left brain culture label that we put on it. And that isn't what remote viewing is all about. Okay, let's talk about an entirely different philosophy in remote viewing now. We're not going to have to, in this one, meditate and get quiet and let this signal come through and so forth and so on. We're going to talk about an entirely different philosophy of remote viewing that was put forth by Ingo Swann, a world-class remote viewer. Ingo was tasked under contract from us to advance the abilities of our cadre of remote viewers in the Army, and he came up with a system which he nicknamed coordinate remote viewing because it has to do with using coordinates as the cue or to direct the remote viewer. As it turns out, you don't have to do that. You can use coordinate remote viewing with sealed envelopes, but there's no such thing called sealed envelope remote viewing. So the idea of this thing called coordinate remote viewing is a system that you learn. The rules of this system have to do with a very specific, highly detailed, stay-in-structure kind of a situation. The presumption is that the information, the remote viewing information, the signal line or the psychic information operates through the autonomic nervous system and expresses itself in your body. And Ingo thought that we could detect and decode this information that's flowing into our autonomic nervous systems through a process of structure. So he broke things down into steps and wants you to detect, decode, and objectify through proper structure. So there were these, very strict rules that you had to go through, and we're going to kind of talk about what that process is. You want to ready the remote viewer, and this does not mean laying down and meditating and getting into an altered state of consciousness. That has nothing to do with this type or style of remote viewing. You iterate the prompt to him, you read the coordinates to him, and then his job to detect the signal line, decode it, and objectify it. To objectify means to take out of mental space and bring into physical space through verbalizing and writing. You might want to reiterate the prompt. Again, you might say, one more time, but you would say, so many degrees north, so many degrees west. Each time the remote viewer would approach the target, the aperture would open and more information could be taken in. So the first level of information that you would get would be just a few little kind of ideas. The next time you opened up the aperture, the next time you heard the coordinates, you'd get more information and more, and then detecting and decoding as we went along. How do we analyze this coordinate remote viewing? Well, you analyze this through how well did the person stay in structure. You look at his remote viewing session and you look at the way he wrote things down in proper structure. He just didn't off the wall come up with something. He stayed in this defined structure. You look at the summary, for at the end of his remote viewing, you ask him to go back and look at the data and write a summary. So you look at his written summary and you compare his stage 5 interrogations and stage 6 models, which are something that we'll talk about a little bit later. Where does the information come from in coordinate remote viewing? Remember, this is an entire different system, an entire different philosophy of thought. In this concept of remote viewing, the remote viewer doesn't move his thoughts or his perception from here to there. That's not how the concept of coordinate remote viewing is. The concept of coordinate remote viewing is that all information is in some sort of a holographic representation called the matrix by Inga Swann, and that you're accessing the matrix. You're kind of going to the famous library in the sky and looking up the book of information about this particular site. Edgar Mitchell has written a book and talks about the quantum hologram in the same kind of a concept. But Inga Swann called this thing a matrix. So the idea is when you do the remote viewing, when you give the prompt, you're going to the matrix, recovering the signal line, opening the aperture, maintaining your structure, and you go through specific stages of remote viewing. The first stage being a small aperture opening, the second stage being a little wider, and it all has to be done in this very strict structure that you must maintain. So let's look at the stages. What are these stages, and what is the structure you have to go through anyway here? The word stage 1 can be describing an actual site or describing the stage at which you are remote viewing. I'm now doing stage 1 remote viewing, but it also can be used as a classification type of a site because all sites have a stage 1 phase to them. Some have nothing more. Here it's suggesting that this island in the middle of nowhere constitutes this definition of what stage 1 is. So you wouldn't use stage 4 remote viewing against this island because there just isn't a whole lot of information there, It's a stage 1 kind of a thing. Stage 2 sites are a little bit different, a little bit more complex, principally because they have different sensory kinds of characteristics. Stage 3 sites not only have the elements of stage 1 and stage 2, but they also have dimensional elements. Again, you can use the concept of stage to describe the site itself, or you can use it to describe the stage of structure in remote viewing. I'm now doing stage 3 remote viewing kind of a situation. Stage 4 has to do with qualitative kinds of things that happen at the target. Not only is this building really big and it's white and it's noisy, but it has people that are there all the time, and it feels like this, and it has old things in it. So these are qualitative kind of values that happen. Stage 5 remote viewing has to do with interrogating those particular elements that you picked up in stage 4. So if in stage 4 you said people, in stage 5 I would ask you to put your pen down on the word people and tell me about those people. So it's interrogating the actual data that you got from stage 4. In stage 6 would be the ability to actually physically model in clay or other kinds of modes the actual site, an actual three-dimensional model of the site. So then it would show that some things have insides and outsides and height and depth and so forth and so on. The first thing you do is take in the signal information, the stage 1 kinds of things, the overall gestalt of the thing. Think of the island situation. You're going to take in the stage 1 essences of it. Now everything has a stage 1 essence or gestalt to it. And the way in which you detect and decode this is, first of all, taking an ideogram. You kind of put your pen or pencil on the paper, and there's always a very specific place on the paper where you write these things because you're training your Pavlovian dog yourself as to where things are on the paper, pull out always that same kind of information. So you put your pen down on the paper and you spontaneously make a little squiggle, which is called an ideogram in this particular case. You make a little squiggle. And then you objectify that little squiggle by saying the words, how it felt, the feeling motion of this. Was it hard and rough? Was it smooth and wavy? Going up, sideways, angular? What is the feeling motion of what your pen spontaneously did? And then you have a B value in this objectification, which is just kind of a quick stab. When I did this, and I crossed over wavy, the first thing that came in my mind was water. So it gives you a place to write that down. Again, in stage 1, you open up the autonomic nervous system by putting down your pen on the paper. The person reads the prompt, the coordinate to you, and you squiggle on the paper. You don't decide ahead of time, I think I'm going to draw a squiggly line. You kind of let your hand do it itself, and while it's happening, you observe. You crossed over wavy, B, water. So that is the IAB sequence, the ideogram and the A and the B component of the sequence, which constitutes stage 1. This is what it might look like. You read the coordinates over here, and you squiggle that, and while you squiggled that, you'd say, okay, A, a crossed angle up over a crossed angle down. B, structure. Okay, so this is an ideal kind of format. In Ingo Swann's technique, in the CRV technique, this is the only way to extract the information correctly. You must stay in structure. If you jump around, jump outside, you're going to get bollocksed up and it isn't going to be good information. But if you stay in structure, the information will be good. What about stage 2? Stage 2 is sensory kind of input, all the senses that you can think of. Stage 2 is also always written in the center of the page. So you would take your stage 1 information like this, and then you would move on to stage 2 and you would write it down the middle of the page, this kinds of sensory information that you would pick up about the target. And again, I'm reiterating because I want you to get the impact of the way Ingo Swann taught this, okay? You must write these on the page in those places the same time each time, because you're kind of training your mind and your body and your autonomic system. When I put my pen here, out flows stage 2 information. When I put my pen here, out flows an ideogram. When you do hundreds of these, you're training yourself, just like shooting baskets. You're training the muscles to be aware of, this is how high we jump, how hard we push when I'm standing here on the court. So it's the same kind of a situation if you're trying to train yourself. Stage 3 information, as you remember, had something to do with dimensionals. So these are the kinds of dimensional things that would come from the signal line that you would detect, decode, and objectify through the principles of structure. We're talking about a sketch. The way you display out stage 3 dimensionals Some of them can be put down in two, like in stage 2, like the concept of tall. And that might be a dimensional characteristics that you would trip out in 2. When those, when you say red, sticky, hard, tall, well, the minute you start saying those kinds of things in your stage 2 descriptions, it's time to ease on over into stage 3. Moving on from that into stage 4. Stage 4 displays a whole array of information. And you go to a new sheet of paper and you display on that all these different categories. You're going to first start with stage 2. Then you're going to list kind of the words that are dimensional kinds of words, kind of stage 2, stage 3-ish kind of words. Sometimes they can be sketches. Then you're going to express aesthetic impact. What does aesthetic impact mean? Well, kind of the best description that I've been using for the last 20 years is no matter how well someone describes to you how neat the Grand Canyon is, when you walk up to the Grand Canyon, you look out and you go, wow, that's aesthetic impact. Okay? So that kind of thing that just, what Ingo would say, overwhelms the system is called aesthetic impact. So you write those things down on your paper, and he also says you take a break. You set your pen down and don't think about the target for a while because your system has kind of been flooded. It's kind of like, you kind of say, wait a minute, okay, I got to get readjusted again. So the aesthetic impact can kind of shut down the system. It's like when you walk over the Grand Canyon and you say, wow, and somebody's telling you, honey, take a picture, and you say, what? You're in the middle of the wow still. Emotional impact the same way. There are sites that have heavy emotions to them. The Vietnam War Memorial, something like that, has a very emotional kind of impact to it. And if it can overwhelm you emotionally, then you write down, I feel so sad. And then you put your pen down and you kind of take a break and you wait till that sadness passes before you continue on. In stage 4, we talk about tangible things. What are tangible things? Car, building, dumpster, piece of paper. Tangible, touchable things at the target that you pick up in stage 4. Intangibles. Feels like a museum. This is a neat place. Okay? Intangible perceptions of the target you've been assigned. And then analytical overlay. If you hear yourself thinking in your mind, I wonder if this is the Museum of Art. Well, don't keep that a secret locked up in your brain. Objectify, say and write on your paper, I wonder if this is the Museum of Art. Okay? Ingo felt that you must expel this from your system, else it gets stuck in there and becomes something called AOL drive, meaning you go out looking at the target for everything that would justify that it is the Museum of Art. And that's not what remote viewing is about. Okay? So when you hear that little tickling in your brain, you say and write on the paper, I wonder if this is the Museum of Art, and you write down AOL, meaning analytical overlay, and then you take a break. You set your pencil down and you say, okay. And then you go back into it so that you aren't driven by these concepts. There's also another that you call AOL signal. An AOL signal is a very ticklish kind of thing. It's like, I know this must be a swimming pool, okay? But maybe it's a lake, maybe it's a public swimming pool, maybe it, and you don't know, so it's AOL signal. It's a combination of things tickling your mind from memory, and yet it has every element that you know it must be something like that. This is really rarely used. AOL signal is something that people don't usually identify and break out. Now, in this system, you have a particular structure and way in which you must write this on your paper so that you train your system to respond. So you write across the top of your paper in stage 4 these little symbols, and then in those columns you write that information. Again, constantly reinforcing hundreds of times, writing that kind of information on the paper in that position so that you are extracting from your knowledge base of the autonomic nervous system, from the unconscious realms, bringing it up past the lemon into consciousness in structure. Now, let's take a look at an example of stage 5 remote viewing. Given the St. Louis Arch, now move 14.8 kilometers southwest of the St. Louis Arch. First thing you do is you write down, you say and write your IAB sequence, right? That's stage one. This is the first thing you do when I say the words to you. Describe the location 14.8 kilometers southwest of the St. Louis Arch. This is what you do in stage one and stage two. In stage three, you give me a little structured drawing of that. Stage four, this is the kind of thing that you get out of that in stage four. In stage five, what you do with a remote viewer is you ask him, now break out subjects and topics of people. Tell me more about people. Tell me more about the word official. And so he's interrogating his own perceptions of the site that way. That's called stage five remote viewing. When he's through with this session, you ask him to write out a summary. Go back through your structure, look through your structure, and now write in real sentences, write out what that whole thing says to you. You look at your structure and write me in sentences, what is this place? What does all that say to you? What have you found out about this site? So this is what this viewer's summary is here. And for the purposes of this slide, I went to the encyclopedia and got a picture of Ulysses Grant for this slide. So can you think back in your mind now to stages 1, 2, 3, and 4 and see where he kind of drew these conclusions and pulled that out of his perceptions? The feedback is this. It's a restored cabin built by Grant, maintained by the Anheuser-Busch Company as a historical site. Now, again, notice the remote viewer didn't come out and say, oh, I see, Anheuser-Busch is here. That's what this is. The remote viewer did the best he could describing a really good stage 5 coordinate remote viewing session. But he didn't say 147 West Main Street. In summary, this process of remote viewing has shown us our perceptual abilities, our ability to look out and describe things beyond our 5 physical senses is possible. So that must mean we as human beings must be in some way greater than just our 5 physical senses if we're able to become aware of these things. We get to play a little bit here. The next slide is, of course, the answer to this. Using either the meditative style of remote viewing or coordinate remote viewing, where you would write down in the column the next site and today's date, right? And see if you can get a stage 1 ideogram, the stage 2s, the dimensionals. Take a few minutes to do this, or enter into your favorite conducive meditative state of consciousness. This is what Joe McMoneagle came up with. Does anybody have any concepts that are similar to what Joe McMoneagle thought this site was? Yeah, is there anything that looks like this or different?
Coming circular, and it's like a cone coming down this way. It's like there's almost like beams of light coming out of the central spot.
Okay, and had a circular shape to it. Beams of light coming out of the central place.
Forming a cone shape.
Okay.
So that circle up there is kind of
So that circle up there reminds you of that. Okay. Okay.
clouds or whatever it was.
Okay, good. Anybody else want to volunteer anything or see any similarities between what they perceived and what Joe McMoneagle drew here? A pine tree. Something tall, something pointed. Okay. Corrugated tin or something. Anybody else want to volunteer anything? Okay. Let's then focus on this. What what did Joe say about this? He said it has tall and thin, reminded him of a lightning rod, had some sort of heavy base. It's definitely not a rocket. You know, after he draws it, and he says, gee whiz, that drawing looks like a rocket. And then he wants to write down for us, this is not a rocket. I didn't really need to draw a rocket here. So he wants to say that. There's concrete at the base, it's tall. And then there's this circular thing with a glowing area up there at the top. What do you think that could be up there? What would he try to describe? Lighthouse might be a concept. You were trying to describe something cone-shaped or something that was emanating something light, maybe. Okay? So it seems that remote viewers, even all of us in the room, are having a little difficulty with what's this thing at the top here? Why is it so hard to describe? What's the problem here? It presents a little difficulty for remote viewing. Well, this is what the site is here. A wind generator. So Joe picked up a few of the energy elements. This thing generates electrical energy. And these fan blades obviously spin around in the wind as they were. So there's different elements that were described correctly. This remote viewing thing works. But again, if we were using this for informational purposes, if the missing body of the kidnapped child was underneath there, could we have found it from that remote viewing? No, not unless you had a psychic analyst, you know, who looked at Joe's drawing and said, I know what that is. That's the windmill field down outside of San Diego, you know, kind of a thing. Let's do one last one, and then we'll open this for questions here. Where was I on August 14th? Time of the day. Good question. All day. Till about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. 9 in the morning till 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And don't think of that as being business hours, because I wasn't in my office. I'll give you a hint, I wasn't in my office. There are several analytical techniques of judging the validity and increasing the probability that you're collecting valid information from remote viewers, which is beyond the scope of this lecture that I'm giving here. But one of those ways is to use multiple sources. So let's start talking then about this. Let's share with each other and see whether or not we can pick up some elements from each other that might describe this. Does anybody have something they want to share? Some idea about?
You were outside.
Okay. Outside. You have two choices, outside or inside. Didn't have any horses. Mm-hmm.
Saw something round, flexible. I didn't think of it as maybe a raft or an inflatable. I saw some kind of canyon, and then I filled in the pieces inside from the rear raft. The canyon.
Yeah, filling in the pieces is dangerous. When he said canyon, what did you? Okay. The word canyon is interesting. We'll have to break that out and see what the word canyon means. Mm-hmm. I think the thrill part of it is correct. Anybody else have anything to volunteer? Canyon. Canyon to me says, walls. If you think of the kind of the Grand Canyon thing, if you think of walls, canyon having some sort of defined walls to it. Mm-hmm. Would that fit the canyon thing that you could only go in? Okay. Stadium concept? A rounded area? Okay. What made you say, your notion is correct, And what made you say cave? How does that fit for you? If it were a tunnel, you would go through the tunnel. Okay.
The first thing I saw was actually like a hole in the ground, and that didn't look more like inflexible.
Okay.
Where I got
The raft kind of concept, but a hole in the ground. Okay. We have a concept of a canyon or walls confining something. You know, you could look down a city street with buildings going up on either side and say, well, that's kind of like a canyon. I'm not saying I was in a city. I'm saying that that's the flavor of that kind of a percept that you're having. We have a statement of something that goes one way, a cave perhaps, where you could go down someplace and go into it, but you couldn't come back out again. So the walls of the canyon, or you go down a canyon, unless it's maybe a box canyon, you know, that has no end to it. Any other kinds of, rather than, we've all been talking about dimensional kinds of shape things, any more sense of, was I excited, was I bored, what kinds of activities might have I been involved in when you think about August 14th? You know, we're kind of pushing the threshold now, challenging your perception. Anybody have any kind of sense or feelings about that? Anxiety? A focused attention, yet interested, okay? Moving in something ancient or old. That's kind of off the wall, because other people were saying excited or thinking. Moving in something ancient or old is kind of a strange thing to say. What made you say that? Do you understand how difficult my question is? You know, if you question a remote viewer and you say, well, what made you say that? And it's like, well, you know, moving in something old, what was it? Looking at something old. Moving while I'm seeing it. Okay, interesting. That was really off the wall, different than the other ones. Very strange. What did you say? Going through some sort of motion? What made you... Color red, too, is important. Okay. I did get sunburned. Okay. This is the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan, Mexico. I spent the day in the ceremonial cave 100 meters underneath the Pyramid of the Sun in Mexico, listening to an ancient recreation of a Mayan ceremony. So there were some very interesting kinds of things that people said. Feeling of ancient things, caves, you can only go in one way. Very interesting things came up. And it's now 9 o'clock, and that kind of is the end of my formal discussion. Are there any questions? For those of you who are interested more in the military remote viewing program, you might try Jim Schnabel's book called Remote Viewers. Jim Schnabel was an investigative reporter, and he spent a couple of years going around and interviewing everybody he could find in the military program, and did a fairly accurate investigative report of the military remote viewing program, the one that I was involved in. Remember, I have only one small piece of the pie, and that was training the cadre of remote viewers to address this from a security issue standpoint.
Do you see a correlation in near-death experiences and ability to do a remote viewing?
Okay, let's broaden that question. The question first is do people that have near-death experiences make better remote viewers? That's a really good question. In the 6 criterion that Stanford Research Institute gave us for looking for people who could do remote viewing, having a previous near-death experience was not on that list. However, I have dealt with probably 50 remote viewers over the last 20 years and thousands of remote viewing sessions. And I think people that have had consciousness-raising experiences in the past do make better remote viewers. They simply have a broader way of looking at the world and aren't quite limited in their thinking. Now that scope might be meditative practices, near-death experiences, UFO encounters, spiritual kinds of experiences that they may have had. I think all of those have something to do with opening your mind to be able to do this thing called remote viewing. Phonetics, reading, Ingo Swann called that stage 7 remote viewing, and he used to play with that in terms of racehorses, trying to get the racehorse names, and thought that would be a good way to test and develop the thing called remote viewing. Only the most senior remote viewers seem to be able to do reading like we think of reading letters, but it almost always, the evidence for that almost always comes out of some sort of a otherwise gestalt pattern, like the reading of an exit sign, or the reading of the word danger, or the reading of the word radiation. And so you might say, look, they can actually read. But there's always been some sort of like importance connection to that, because it had some more meaning to it. Let's look at what letters and words are. They are artificial constructs on which we put our own meaning. And that doesn't seem to have a really big psychic signature. It seems to be kind of transient across all of time and space. It's a difficult thing to do. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't deal with that issue. One time when I had a task to locate a spy, he was suspected of being in Austria at a specific time, so we were given coordinates of a town square to look at and see if we could find him there. I put the remote viewer down on the target, and he described an open square in a European city, so I had some sort of confidence he was right there, and he said, well, there's a man sitting on the park bench reading a newspaper, and I said, well, go stand behind him. And he came back and said, okay. And I said, what's the newspaper say? And he says, I don't know, I can't read Czech. And I said, well, if it was in English, what it would say? Oh, he's reading about the accident that happened downtown yesterday. And so the idea that there is some sort of limitation there is what is the problem, not that the information envelope isn't detectable. So it is difficult to read words. When words are symbols like the exit sign, that seems to come through really well, but there are ways to get around that limitation.
What are you doing with the remote, the Monroe Institute, and wanting to team up with them?
The Monroe Institute, of course, was founded after Bob Monroe, the famous out-of-body guy. When I was with the government program and we were looking for ways to enhance the abilities of our viewers, I went to the Monroe Institute because they teach this meditative state kind of a thing, and I thought it would help with the extended remote viewing. And Joe McMonagle went through the training down there at the Institute, as well as a couple of other remote viewers. And it did seem to help in terms of teaching them how to get into this conducive mental state. They call it their cool down time, where they get into this state and then they're ready to do their remote viewing. I retired from the military back in 1988, and Bob Monroe asked me to come down and join the staff there at the Institute at that time. So I have been there for over 10 years now at the Institute. Yes?
Can you comment on the use of remote viewing to see extraterrestrial bodies?
Yeah, that's an interesting concept. I gave a lecture about the Monroe Institute and about remote viewing in Denver. And after the lecture, a guy came up to me and said, we'd like you to come and give a talk at the UFO convention in Nevada. And I'm like, you must have the wrong guy, you know. My name's Skip Atwater. I'm from the Monroe Institute. You know, you probably want to talk to one of these other people over here. I said, no. You know, I saw your remote viewing talk, and I think that if you could come to our thing and give this on remote viewing. And I said, well, why? He said, well, kind of probing him to see what kind of a guy this is. And he says, well, we think that maybe you could use remote viewing to look at UFOs. I mean, we have a space-time kind of problem dealing with the UFO issue. Maybe remote viewing is a way to do that. And so I first said, well, you know, in my head I'm thinking, do I want to get into this? I have some files of a remote viewer of Pat Price. Do you know who Pat Price is? And he said, no, I don't know who Pat Price is. So I explained to him that Pat Price was involved in the original SRI program and that he was a very famous, very good remote viewer. And that in 1973, he gave an envelope to Dr. Puthoff identifying 4 UFO bases on the planet. Would he be interested in learning about that? And he said, oh, yes, that would be very fine. So I went home and dug out that old file about the 4 UFO bases and what Pat Price had said, which he did in 1973. Now in 1980, 1982 and 83, who was I? Well, in my past life experience, I was a military intelligence officer with a team of remote viewers. And I had also used the information that Pat Price gave us to check on those sites with my people as well. So here I had a nice little briefing package, and I went out to Nevada and gave a talk about this, about the original data that Pat Price brought to us about underground UFO bases and the work that I did with my remote viewers to try to verify whether or not what Pat Price said was true. So I do have a little history at looking at the UFO problem, UFO adventure, with the idea of remote viewing. And I think it's probably an interesting idea. But let's not forget the limitations of remote viewing. Let's not forget the aquarium up in Seattle and how you can be told bits and pieces of information, but it isn't like this panacea that resolves everything. And in the military intelligence use, when you ask an intelligence question, you use multiple kinds of intelligence to answer that question. You might get overhead satellite imagery, you might get a spy recruited to work where this guy works, and you might tap his phone and so forth and so on. And so you do all of these things to answer the question that you want to know. And remote viewing is just one more of all of those things you could do to collect information. You know, I'm really glad you asked that question. You get to hold the quarter, I guess. My dad always used to say, when one of us kids would do something good, he'd say, you get to hold the nickel. It wasn't like he would give it to you, but you got to hold it for a while, you know. And so I've inflated that to being a quarter now. Inflation, you know. Right, exactly. When I gave this talk before in Denver, I was talking about remote viewing and practical applications. And somebody out of the audience said, well, what practical applications does remote viewing have? And I immediately knew that I was going to have to change the title of the talk. Because although there's lots of information and lots of interesting things you can do, and if you have a, let's stop a minute and do a sidebar. What practical value is being able to shoot a ball through a hoop? You know, what value is that anyway? It's just recreation and exercise and so forth and so on. Well, but if we put you together in a team, and we put 2 teams together, and then we charge admission, and then we develop world stars, well, you still have that question in the back of your mind, what value is it? So it depends on the situation. On a personal situation for you alone, yes, I think it's a development kind of a process. You can put a group of remote viewers together, give them a specific goal, like helping the police or intelligence applications or personal kinds of missing person sort of things. And that has some sort of practical value. But after that, in my heart, what I really think in my heart is that remote viewing ought to be taught in college campuses like geometry and literature and art appreciation as part of the curriculum. Because when somebody said, listen, when you were in school and took solid geometry, what practical application did that have in your life? What practical application did appreciation of early American authors have? And it's like, you can't quite, I remember high school, a train leaving New York at 300 miles an hour and one leaving from Chicago. And what practical application did that have? Well, the answer is that it opened your world and your thinking processes and your awareness and your first-person experience of the world to be broader than those who didn't have those educational experiences. And therein lies, I think, the value of remote viewing. So if kids had a college course, Psychology 203, learn how to do remote viewing, and I'm not talking about an academic overview course of the history of remote viewing. I'm talking about a hands-on practical thing where they learn how to do it. I think that it broadens their perspective of who and what they are and how they relate to the world, and they become greater beings for that. Is that practical? In my heart it is.
I guess my first concern is you open up to your energy, to your attention.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do it in a way where you don't become overwhelmed? So, obviously, and the other question, you said that the program ended with the military in 95,
Now, this question of dangers comes up, and it's very interesting. Jim Schnabel kept asking me about, well, aren't there any dangers to this? What about dangers of not being connected with this world anymore? Will you be able to do your shopping list and drive your car, or will you be all buzzed out all the time and the whole universe and so forth and so on? How about that? My feeling is that there are no dangers like that. But there are dangers in everything we do in life. If you go out playing basketball with your buddies 3 nights a week, you're in danger of getting divorced because you aren't home 3 nights a week, you know. So in everything we do, apparently there are dangers. Now, I have not identified any kind of psychiatric danger or spiritual danger for remote viewing. But I come philosophically from a concept that we remote view all the time. The label remote viewing is a scientific label that the researchers put on it to narrow down this process. But we are aware and in touch with each other as beings all the time. It's just what bubbles up to our threshold. So I really don't think there are any inherent dangers. Now, have there been people who get into problems? Yes. Why is that? Well, because they involve themselves in this thing because they're already having problems. Getting involved in this kind of a world is breaking down the barriers and the structures of the physical society and domains we have. And if you're already taking lithium because of that, you probably don't want to get involved in this. I'm kind of a metaphysical kind of guy, so again, I think of the evolving human consciousness. What are we becoming as human beings on the planet? What is it that we are evolving to? What is this thing called Earth changes about? Why is it that we are all aware that we are on the leading wave of something that is about to happen? And I think by expanding and becoming greater beings through learning about things like remote viewing, learning about all these other technologies makes us more knowledgeable, makes us greater beings, and thereby contributes to this quantum change that we are leaping into. I think we're talking about the essence of who we are as conscious beings here, and that we are aware of things beyond our 5 physical senses. And getting back to Monroe world, we are more than our physical bodies.